It was a peaceful Sunday morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Pine Grove. The sun had just started warming the carefully manicured lawns when Mr. Wilson, a beloved 70-year-old retired teacher, stepped out to collect his mail. He'd lived in this house for over 2 decades, teaching generations of local kids and becoming a pillar of the community. As he bent down to pick up his newspaper, a police cruiser slowly rolled to a stop near his driveway. The officer inside watched him with suspicious eyes, then stepped out of his vehicle. "Excuse me, sir," the officer called out, his hand resting casually on his belt. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." Mr. Wilson straightened up slowly, his arthritis making quick movements impossible. "Good morning, officer," he replied politely, clutching his mail. "I live here. Have lived here for 20 years now." The officer's expression hardened. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he demanded, taking a step closer. "This is an upscale neighborhood, and we need to make sure everything's in order." Mr. Wilson's neighbors began peeking through their windows, drawn by the confrontation unfolding on their usually peaceful street. Mrs. Thompson from next door stepped onto her porch but remained silent, her morning coffee forgotten in her trembling hands. A small figure watched from behind a nearby oak tree. A 12-year-old boy who often helped Mr. Wilson tend to his garden. The boy's heart raced as he saw the fear in his elderly friend's eyes. His parents had taught him about moments like these, about standing up for what's right while staying safe. "Sir, I just stepped out to get my mail," Mr. Wilson explained calmly, though his voice quivered slightly. "My ID is inside the house." "Then we'll have to verify your residence another way," the officer replied, his tone growing increasingly hostile. "People like you don't typically live in neighborhoods like this." The boy's hand brushed against his phone in his pocket. His parents had always told him about the importance of documenting injustice. With shaking fingers, he pulled out his phone and started recording, making sure to capture everything clearly. More neighbors emerged from their homes, forming a silent audience to the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with growing concern, but nobody stepped forward to help. The officer continued his interrogation, each question more pointed than the last. Mr. Wilson stood his ground with dignity, but the boy could see the hurt and humiliation in his mentor's eyes. The same eyes that lit up when sharing stories about his teaching days, the same eyes that twinkled with pride when the boy mastered a new gardening technique. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn as the confrontation continued, and the boy felt something building inside him. A mixture of anger, courage, and determination. He knew what he had to do, even though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This wasn't just about a morning mail check gone wrong. This was about right and wrong, about standing up for someone who had shown nothing but kindness to everyone he met. The boy took a deep breath, steadied his phone, and prepared to step out from behind the tree. What happened next would change their community forever. The crowd of onlookers grew larger as the confrontation continued. The boy's hands were sweating as he held his phone steady, making sure to capture everything clearly. He could see his neighbors shifting uncomfortably, their morning routines forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. The officer's voice grew louder, echoing through the previously peaceful street. "I'm going to need you to put that mail down, sir," he commanded, taking another step toward Mr. Wilson. "Until we verify your residence, that could be considered mail theft." Mr. Wilson's shoulders slumped slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Officer, I've lived here since before you started wearing that badge. I taught at Pine Grove Elementary for 30 years. Many of these neighbors watching right now, my students." A few people in the crowd nodded, but still, no one spoke up. The boy noticed Mrs. Thompson dabbing at her eyes with her sleeve, while Mr. Parker from across the street kept checking his phone, perhaps wondering if he should call someone for help. The morning sun grew hotter, and the boy could see beads of sweat forming on Mr. Wilson's forehead. The elderly man's arthritis was acting up. The boy could tell by the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, something he always did when his joints were hurting during their gardening sessions. The officer circled Mr. Wilson like a predator, his boots crunching on the perfectly maintained lawn. "Teaching history doesn't prove residence," he sneered. "For all I know, you could be casing these houses, looking for an opportunity." The boy's blood boiled at these words. How dare anyone speak to Mr. Wilson this way? This was the same man who spent hours teaching neighborhood kids about different plants, who organized community cleanups, who always had a kind word and a smile for everyone he met. From his hiding spot, the boy noticed something important. The officer's body camera wasn't on. Its usual red light was dark. He remembered what his parents had taught him about citizens' rights and police accountability. His phone felt heavy in his hands, but he knew he was doing the right thing by recording. More neighbors arrived, some still in their pajamas and robes. The boy recognized faces from block parties, summer barbecues, and community meetings. These were people who had eaten Mr. Wilson's famous apple pie, who had celebrated holidays together, who had built a community together. Yet they all stood frozen, fear and uncertainty keeping them silent. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. The boy could hear birds singing in the distance, such a stark contrast to the ugly scene unfolding before him. He thought about all the times Mr. Wilson had stood up for others, helping new families move in, organizing support for neighbors in need, speaking up at community meetings to make sure everyone's voice was heard. Now Mr. Wilson needed someone to stand up for him. The boy's heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He had been taught about justice, about right and wrong, about the importance of speaking truth to power. His fingers tightened around his phone as he made his decision. The time for hiding was over. Sometimes the smallest voice can make the biggest difference, and he was about to prove it. Taking a deep breath, the boy stepped out from behind the oak tree. His footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of the morning. The officer's head snapped toward him, but the boy kept his phone steady and his voice even clearer. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his young voice carrying across the lawn. "I'm recording this interaction for everyone's safety." His words, though spoken by a child, held the weight of conviction. The officer's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Kid, this doesn't concern you. Go home." But the boy stood his ground, remembering everything his parents had taught him. "Actually, sir, it does concern me. Mr. Wilson is my neighbor, and what you're doing right now is called racial profiling. That's against the law." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mr. Wilson's eyes widened with surprise and pride, while the officer's face reddened. The boy continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "According to the Civil Rights Act, you can't demand identification from someone just because of how they look or where they are. Mr. Wilson is getting his mail from his own house. That's not suspicious activity." The morning sun caught the screen of his phone as he held it steady. "Also, I noticed your body camera isn't on. Department policy requires it to be activated during all civilian interactions. I learned that at the community outreach program last summer." More neighbors began pulling out their phones, inspired by the boy's courage. The silent audience was finding its voice, with murmurs of agreement spreading through the crowd. "That's right," someone called out. "He's lived here longer than most of us." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand falling away from his belt. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. A young boy armed with nothing but knowledge and a phone had changed everything. Furthermore, the boy continued, his voice clear and steady, "Mr. Wilson has the right to feel safe in his own neighborhood. He taught me about civil rights in his garden last summer while we were planting tomatoes. He taught at our school for 30 years, and now you're treating him like a criminal for checking his own mailbox." Tears welled up in Mr. Wilson's eyes, but he stood taller now. The officer looked around at the sea of phones recording him, at the determined face of a child speaking truth to power, at the community finally finding its collective voice. "I'm going to call your supervisor," the boy said, his free hand already dialing the number he'd memorized from the community bulletin board. "And I'm sending this video to the local news station. My mom taught me how to do that." The officer's demeanor changed completely. His aggressive stance melted away, replaced by barely concealed embarrassment. He knew he'd been caught, not just doing something wrong, but being schooled about it by a child who understood the law better than he did. The crowd had grown larger now, and people were stepping forward, sharing their own stories about Mr. Wilson's kindness, his decades of service to the community, his impact on their lives. The morning had transformed from a moment of injustice to a powerful display of community solidarity, all because one brave boy decided to speak up. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a community finding its voice, about the power of knowledge over force, about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. And it all started with a child who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The officer's supervisor arrived within minutes, his patrol car rolling up to a scene very different from what usually greeted him on morning calls. Instead of chaos, he found unity. Instead of fear, he found strength. The whole neighborhood had gathered on Mr. Wilson's lawn, forming a protective circle around their elderly neighbor and the brave young boy who'd changed everything. The boy's phone was still recording as he calmly explained what had happened. His voice didn't shake anymore, it carried the confidence of someone who knew they were standing on the right side of history. He played back the video, showing the supervisor how the initial officer had approached Mr. Wilson without cause, how he'd made assumptions based on appearance, how he'd failed to follow proper procedure. And here, the boy pointed out, is where he threatened Mr. Wilson about the mail. But look at the address on those envelopes. They clearly show this is Mr. Wilson's house. Anyone could see that. The supervisor listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. The original officer stood to the side, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. The tables had turned completely, and everyone knew it. Mr. Wilson had finally retrieved his ID, not because he needed to prove anything anymore, but because he wanted to show the supervisor something special. It was an old photo ID from his teaching days, showing him standing in front of Pine Grove Elementary 30 years ago. I taught many of these people's children, Mr. Wilson explained, his voice strong again, including this young man's parents. We're not just neighbors here, we're family. The supervisor turned to address the crowd. I want to apologize on behalf of the department, he said, his words careful and sincere. This is not how we train our officers to behave. This is not what community policing looks like. The original officer was called aside for a private conversation with his supervisor. Through the crowd's murmuring, words like suspension and retraining could be heard. But something even more remarkable was happening on Mr. Wilson's lawn. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up earlier were now sharing their stories. One woman talked about how Mr. Wilson had helped her son with math homework every Tuesday for an entire school year. Another remembered how he'd organized a fundraiser when the local library was about to close. The boy's video had already started making rounds on social media. Local news vans were pulling up, their reporters drawn by the unusual sight of an entire neighborhood standing together on a suburban lawn. But this wasn't just another viral video, this was a moment of real change. Community leaders began arriving, drawn by the calls and messages flooding their phones. They found something unexpected. Not a scene of conflict, but a neighborhood discovering its own power. The boy's simple act of courage had sparked something larger than himself. The morning sun was high in the sky now, casting no shadows for anyone to hide in. People who had lived next door to each other for years were really talking for the first time, sharing phone numbers, making plans for community meetings. What had started as a moment of injustice was transforming into a movement for change. Through it all, the boy stood by Mr. Wilson's side, his phone finally lowered but his spirit soaring. He'd done more than just stand up to one officer, he'd awakened his community's conscience. And this was just the beginning. By afternoon, the boy's video had spread far beyond their small community. Local news stations weren't just covering the story, they were diving deep into the bigger issues it represented. The boy found himself sitting in Mr. Wilson's living room, surrounded by cameras and microphones, but he wasn't nervous anymore. I just did what was right, he explained to the reporters, his voice clear and honest. My parents always taught me that staying quiet when you see something wrong is the same as saying it's okay. And what happened to Mr. Wilson wasn't okay. The police department had to respond publicly. The chief of police called a press conference right there in the neighborhood, choosing Mr. Wilson's front yard as the location, a powerful symbol that wasn't lost on anyone. He didn't try to defend the officer's actions. Instead, he announced immediate changes. What we saw today was a failure of training, a failure of judgment, and a failure of basic human decency, the chief declared. But we also saw something remarkable. We saw a child with more wisdom and courage than many adults. We saw a community finally finding its voice. The changes came quickly. The officer was placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation, but more importantly, the department announced new training programs, and they wanted the boy to be part of them. They asked him to speak to new officers about community relations, about the importance of treating everyone with respect. Mr. Wilson's house became the heart of something bigger. People from neighboring communities started showing up, sharing their own stories of discrimination, but also their stories of hope. The boys' parents watched with pride as their son's brave act sparked conversations that were long overdue. Social media couldn't get enough of the story. The video kept spreading, but it wasn't just about one incident anymore. People were sharing their own experiences, their own moments of standing up against injustice. The boys' actions had given others courage to speak up too. Local schools reached out, asking Mr. Wilson to come back as a guest speaker. They wanted him to teach students about civil rights, about standing up for what's right. And they wanted the boy to join him, showing young people that age doesn't determine courage. Community meetings that used to draw just a handful of people were now packed. The boy attended them all, sitting quietly next to Mr. Wilson, listening as neighbors discussed ways to make real changes. They weren't just talking about police reform. They were talking about building a stronger community, about looking out for each other. The boy's phone kept ringing with interview requests from national news outlets, but he stayed grounded. "I'm not special," he told Mr. Wilson one evening as they worked in the garden together. "I just did what anyone should do. The special thing is seeing everyone come together like this." Mr. Wilson smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to show adults what they should have known all along," he said, patting the boy's shoulder. "You didn't just help me that morning, you woke up an entire community." The story was becoming a movement, spreading from one neighborhood to another. Other communities started organizing their own meetings, their own training programs. The boy's simple act of courage was creating ripples that kept growing bigger, touching more lives than he could have imagined. 1 month after the incident, the police department's training center looked very different. Photos of community members lined the walls, and a large screen played videos of real interactions between officers and citizens. The boy's video was among them, but now it was being used as a teaching tool. The boy sat in the front row of the training room, watching as new officers learned about community policing. His presence wasn't just symbolic, he was there as an instructor, sharing his perspective on that morning that changed everything. "The badge doesn't make you powerful," he told the officers in training. "What makes you powerful is earning the community's trust." The room fell silent as he spoke, seasoned officers and trainees alike taking notes on wisdom coming from someone who hadn't even started high school. Mr. Wilson joined these sessions too, sharing his experiences from both sides, as a respected teacher and as someone who had faced discrimination. Together, they helped design a new training program that focused on understanding the community's history, its people, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The original officer who had confronted Mr. Wilson that morning was going through a different kind of training. After his suspension, he requested to be part of the change. He stood up during one session, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I was doing my job," he admitted to the room. "But a child showed me that following procedures without humanity isn't really doing the job at all." His honesty sparked important discussions about implicit bias and the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. The changes weren't just happening in the police department. Schools across the district started incorporating civil rights education into their curriculum. They used the boy's story to teach students about civic responsibility and the power of speaking up. Community watch programs transformed into community bridge programs. Instead of looking for suspicious activity, neighbors focused on getting to know each other better. Weekly gatherings started happening in different homes, with Mr. Wilson's garden becoming a favorite meeting spot. The boys' parents watched their son grow into his new role with amazement. He was still the same kid who loved playing video games and riding his bike, but he'd also become something more. A symbol of hope for his community. Local businesses got involved too. The neighborhood coffee shop started hosting monthly community conversations where residents and police officers could meet informally. The owner put up a photo of the boy and Mr. Wilson in the window, with the words "Courage starts with one voice" underneath. The police chief made good on his promises for reform. Body cameras were now checked at the start of every shift. Monthly reports on police interactions were made public. But most importantly, officers were required to spend time in the communities they served, not just patrolling them. As summer turned to fall, the boy and Mr. Wilson continued their gardening sessions. But now they often had company, other kids from the neighborhood, police officers on their breaks, community members who just wanted to be part of something positive. The garden became a symbol of growth, not just for plants, but for people and relationships too. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning at the mailbox. The neighborhood had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The local community center was hosting a special ceremony, and every seat was filled. The boy stood at the podium, looking out at faces that were no longer just neighbors, but family. "When I stepped out from behind that tree last year," he began, his voice carrying through the packed room, "I was scared. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Mr. Wilson sat in the front row, beaming with pride. His garden had grown into a community project, with vegetables and flowers now feeding and beautifying the whole neighborhood. Every Saturday, people gathered there to plant, talk, and build bridges across all kinds of divides. The police department had become a national model for community engagement. Officers regularly joined neighborhood events, not as authority figures, but as community members. The training program that the boy and Mr. Wilson helped design had been adopted by departments in other cities. The original officer who had caused all this was there too, but he was different now. He'd become one of the strongest advocates for police reform, traveling to other departments to share his story of transformation. "A child taught me more about being a good police officer than all my years of training," he often said. Local schools had seen changes too. Students were more engaged in civic education, asking questions, standing up for each other. The boy's story had become part of the curriculum, teaching kids that they had the power to make a difference, no matter their age. The Neighborhood Watch app that once spread fear and suspicion had been replaced by a community support network. People shared everything from extra garden vegetables to job opportunities. When someone needed help, the whole community stepped up. Mr. Wilson's house had become a landmark of sorts. People would drive by just to see the famous garden where it all started. But for the locals, it was more than that. It was where they gathered for barbecues, community meetings, and celebrations. The boy had grown taller over the year, but his spirit remained the same. He still helped Mr. Wilson in the garden every week, still spoke at police training sessions, still reminded everyone that change starts with one person willing to stand up. "Look around," he said at the ceremony, gesturing to the diverse crowd. "This is what community looks like. This is what happens when we stop being afraid of each other and start listening. This is what happens when we remember that we're all human." The ceremony wasn't just about celebrating the past year, it was about looking forward. The community had created a scholarship fund for students who showed exceptional courage in standing up for others. The first recipient would be announced that day. As the boy finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't just clapping, it was the sound of hope, of change, of a community that had found its voice. The story that began with one brave boy and one faithful recording had become something much bigger. It had become a blueprint for change. And in the back of the room, a young girl watched with wide eyes, clutching her phone, ready to be the next person to stand up for what was right.